Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, which celebrates Walktober in Maryland with a special Walkinar on Maryland initiatives hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Maryland Department of Transportation. My name is Jill Lemke. I serve as the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning. The Maryland Departments of Planning and Transportation work closely and in partnership to advance transportation and land use planning with the goal of supporting vibrant communities, promoting safe transportation options, and connecting all Marylanders to opportunities and each other. The Walkinar series takes place every Thursday in October as part of a larger webinar series produced by the Maryland Department of Planning, featuring a variety of smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website provides other valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities at planning.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. For more information on Walktober and related activities, please visit the Maryland Department of Transportation's website, where you can find previous Walkinar videos and registration links for future events. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To receive AICP credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org, then log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for event number 9277205. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the Department of Transportation, or the state of Maryland. Following their presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question for the speakers at any time by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. Before introducing our speakers, please enjoy the short welcome video from Joanna Green, MDOT Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs and Strategy.
Good morning. I'm Joanna Green, Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs and Strategy. Thank you for being here today as we celebrate Maryland's 4th annual Walktober, a month-long series of activities and educational events to promote safe walking and walkability. To learn more about Walktober and to find resources and events happening throughout the month, please visit our website. Following the success of the previous years, we're pleased to continue hosting a series of 4 webinars, or Walkinars, as we call them, each Thursday throughout the month. These Walkinars highlight innovative practices to support walking and walkability and provide important information on safety, equity, health, and infrastructure. To that end, here at MDOT, we are excited to announce the launch of our Sidewalk Data Inventory Collaboration Project, which will evaluate the feasibility of statewide sidewalk data inventory. Pedestrian access statewide to transit centers, major activity centers, and other locations that individuals seek to travel to and from is an essential part of creating an equitable, accessible region for everyone. Sidewalks are an important part of MDOT's new bicycle and pedestrian master plan, as well as the Complete Streets policy. Today's Walkinar will focus on Maryland's pedestrian safety initiatives. We'll hear from Molly Porter, Bicycle and Pedestrian Planner at the State Highway Administration, Doug Mowbray, Data Program Manager at Maryland Highway Safety Office, and Chester Harvey, Director of the Transportation Policy Research Group at the National Center for Smart Growth. I'm looking forward to today's event. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the presentation.
Molly Porter is a bicycle and pedestrian planner with the Maryland State Highway Administration, Office of Planning and Preliminary Engineering, Regional and Intermodal Planning Division. She received her master's degree in community planning from the University of Cincinnati and has been working at SHA since 2022. Her job responsibilities include assisting with the implementation of transportation and safety planning initiatives, including implementation of MDOT SHA's Context-Driven and Access and Mobility for All Users Guide. Doug Mowbray has served the Motor Vehicle Administration's Highway Safety Office for nearly 15 years in the role of Traffic Records Program Manager and Safety Data Analyst. He manages a federal grant program to support the improvement of and access to data sets related to motor vehicle crashes and other traffic safety issues. He is the Maryland Traffic Records Coordinating Committee Facilitator and serves as chair for the Crash Data Accessibility TRCC Subcommittee. Doug and his wife, son, 2 cats, and 4 chickens reside in Harford County, where he and his family are involved in environmental sustainability efforts. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees from Towson University in English and professional writing, and is a published poet and multimedia artist. Chester Harvey directs the Transportation Policy Research Group at the University of Maryland's National Center for Smart Growth, where his research bridges transportation and urban design to investigate how walkability can be better measured and planned for. Chester holds a PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. He formerly led the data science group at Alta Planning and Design. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Candice Holford, Director of Active Transportation for MDOT, for a special introduction. Candice?
Thanks, Jill. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our third Walkinar. I'm Candice Holford, and I direct MDOT's new Office of Active Transportation and Micromobility at the Secretary's Office. The Active Transportation and Micromobility Office focuses on human-powered transportation, so biking and walking, and micromobility, those modes that help us make those first and last mile connections like scooters and electric bikes. We deliver things you might be familiar with, like the Bicycle and Pedestrian Master Plan and our Kim Lamphere Network Bike Waste Program. We're also working on a few new initiatives that will help us get to where we need to be in order to make our communities more walkable. As a Vision Zero state, MDOT will continue to elevate safety to eliminate traffic-related deaths and serious injuries on our roads. And this year, MDOT signed on as one of the first state DOT allies in action, which is an effort to expand the adoption of the National Roadway Safety Strategy. The strategy outlines a way to improve traffic safety, focusing on 5 objectives: safer people, safer vehicles, safer speeds, safer roads, and safer post-crash care. We are also updating our 11-year-old Complete Streets policy and redesigning roads that should be safe and accessible to pedestrians. And this past spring, SHA released its first statewide pedestrian safety action plan for Maryland. The PSAP, Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, is another way MDOT can bring bicycle and sidewalk improvements to your communities. But it also helps us map out how to take action. So we'll advance projects through the PSAP program to change how we think about state highways, particularly in high activity areas. Our new approach elevates safety, sustainability, and accessibility within the transportation framework. Please go on and visit 2050marylandbpmp.com to read our draft Bicycle Pedestrian Master Plan, which recommends the initiatives mentioned and much more. Our comment period will close on November 20th. And now I will hand it over to Ms. Molly Porter, State Highways Bicycle and Pedestrian Planner. Molly?
Hey, thank you so much, Candice, and good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present on Maryland's first Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, or PSAP. Before we dive into the PSAP itself, I'd like to provide an overview of the framework that guided the PSAP development. As Candice mentioned, Maryland was established as a Vision Zero state in 2019, and since that time, SHA has actively worked to achieve the goal of eliminating all traffic fatalities and serious injuries. One initiative to further these efforts is the context-driven framework. The context-driven initiative is made up of 6 different components. First, the context guide helps to define the land use that surrounds and characterizes Maryland's roadways. The Pedestrian Safety Action Plan identifies needs and helps us strategically plan for those needs. The toolkit provides the safety countermeasures required to make improvements. The case studies will show where projects are making a difference and how the countermeasures are performing. The web portal centralizes our resources and streamlines access to information. And finally, training and investing in our planners and designers will inspire innovation and help us build the safest facilities for all users. Today, I'll spend a few minutes explaining how a few of these components advance our context-driven effort, starting with the context-driven guide. As we know, in the past, transportation agencies often viewed the relationship between access and mobility as a one-size-fits-all idea, where a road is either designed for rural mobility or urban access. The context guide aimed to take a different approach and established 6 different contexts in Maryland as shown here. Each context is characterized by different types of land use and development, which directly influence the types of trips, variety of destinations, and presence of pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists on the road. On the screen, we can see the map that illustrates areas throughout the state that contain the characteristics of each context. This map is a starting point to understand A, which types of contexts exist today in Maryland, and which countermeasures may be appropriate to improve safety and circulation given the context. As noted, this map is a starting point, and for each planning, study, and design project, the surrounding land use and characteristics are evaluated for the most appropriate design to accommodate all users, as emphasized by this guide. The map, the guide, and countermeasures work in tandem to support our implementation framework. Next, moving on to the toolkit. Each countermeasure added to the toolkit has its own cut sheet, which shows the reader the applicable context zones for the countermeasure, a definition and description, including an in-depth explanation describing the countermeasure, special considerations to pay attention to in implementing that treatment, and example images of the countermeasure as applied. Other complementary countermeasures that may enhance or maximize safety benefits, and an application section which explains where and how a countermeasure is typically applied. And lastly, a list of state and national guidance and standards that were consulted for the toolkit. These countermeasures can be found on the context-driven web portal, and we plan to continue to update and add countermeasures to this toolkit. Now moving into SHA's Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. So first, it should be noted that everyone is a pedestrian. Even if you drive for most of your trips, everyone is a pedestrian at some point. And to that end, SHA developed the PSAP to answer the question, where and how can we address vulnerable user needs across the SHA transportation system? It should also be noted that while this effort is called the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, other vulnerable users such as cyclists and scooter riders often benefit from pedestrian safety measures, and often bicycle-specific measures are incorporated into these safety projects. The PSAP also advances Maryland's Strategic Highway Safety Plan goals. It considers land use context in the way we design roads, differentiates between mobility and access, and prioritizes roadway design projects that will enhance safety for all Marylanders. Moving into the PSAP process development. This planning process started with data from the Maryland State Highway Administration Office of Traffic Safety and MDOT modal partners, and was analyzed through a context-driven lens in order to establish existing conditions. From the existing conditions, the team was able to identify areas of need to help hone in on where our efforts should focus. Using these areas of need and more data, the team was able to categorize priority corridors throughout the state. Of course, there was more than a pure reliance on data. The team held public engagement sessions to hear directly from the residents of Maryland on where they would like to see improved pedestrian spaces. Crash data collected in the existing conditions phase of this plan can also be used to understand opportunities to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety over time. To that end, the team created report cards to help track the state of pedestrian safety in Maryland. There is one report card for each district. On the screen, we can see the district report card for District 3, which includes Prince George's and Montgomery counties. The report cards currently highlight noteworthy data for 2016 to 2019, and these will be updated so that SHA may identify trends and investigate as needed specific areas or crash types using that data. The report cards can be viewed or downloaded from the context-driven web portal. Once the existing conditions were understood, it was time to identify areas of need, which are broad geographic areas that have the highest need for non-motorized safety improvements. To determine areas of need, the team examined crash numbers and crash severity data, in addition to other factors that are important parts of identifying need. Those factors include public input from the online comment map, equity, and short trip opportunity areas, or STOAs. The next few slides will walk through each of the factors considered. This first layer shows public input, which is the density of comments in each SHA district used to identify the areas of need. Equity was another important component that was considered when defining areas of need. To determine the equity index shown in this map, the team analyzed census tracts throughout Maryland through the lens of factors listed here. Each census tract was assigned a point for each of these factors that was above the statewide average, with a maximum score of 8. Census tracts with scores at or above 4 were used to help identify areas of need. Areas with a higher equity index score would benefit from investment in pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, because high equity index areas tend to rely more frequently on walking and biking, often in conjunction with transit, to reach their destinations. Implementing safe and efficient bicycle and pedestrian facilities in these areas would help connect our citizens to life's opportunities safely. Crash location is another important factor that was considered when defining areas of need. This map shows the density of non-fatal, non-serious crashes in Maryland. The density of these crashes tends to be higher in places where population density is higher. This next map shows only serious and fatal pedestrian and bicycle crashes. It is similar to the previous map. However, you can see that densities in rural and suburban areas are more likely to register on the map than they were when the density of only non-fatal, non-serious crashes were considered. Another factor considered in the areas of need was MDOT's designated short trip opportunity areas, or STOAs. These are areas that were identified as having strong opportunities for people to replace short driving trips with biking or walking trips under the right conditions, such as a safe walking and biking environment. Factors that were used to identify STOAs are listed here. They include employment densities, population densities, school coverage, transit coverage, and zero-car household. Finally, all of these data sets were layered and areas of need identified. This map shows the results. Areas of need were then analyzed in more detail in the prioritization process to identify priority corridors, which are discussed on the next slide. The team used a prioritization analysis that assessed all SHA roadways within each area of need. The factors listed here are what were used to score each roadway segment, including crash data, equity, rail transit walksheds, bus stop density, the SHA bike spine, and schools. This map shows the results of this analysis. The corridors in red represent the priority corridors, or those scoring within the top 15% statewide. I recognize these can be difficult to see on this screen, but this map is available on the context-driven web portal. Now that we have the data and locations, it's time to put this plan into action. SHA will use the PSAP to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety in Maryland in 2 ways: by addressing SHA policies and strategies related to pedestrian and bicycle safety, and by making physical improvement to SHA roadways that make travel safer for all users. The PSAP policies and strategies are shown here and include coordinating with local agencies and jurisdictions, training SHA staff, maintaining infrastructure investments, and participating in events such as this to inform the public about this plan. Throughout the PSAP process, SHA has continued to implement context-driven projects. Over 350 context-driven bicycle and pedestrian improvements have been made throughout the state since 2019. The PSAP will continue to help SHA district offices identify where the need for pedestrian and cyclist safety is greatest. This PSAP will also help us more accurately and proactively make investments. On this slide, we can see the context-driven spot improvement map showing what improvement was made and where. Some of these improvements include speed limit reductions, the installation of bicycle lanes, continental crosswalks, and lane width reductions. This map is also available on the context-driven web portal. Moving forward, SHA has programmed nearly $100 million for safety investments as a starting point to deliver PSAP projects, working with our new active transportation team and district offices. Thank you again for the opportunity to present on this plan, and I will now turn it over to Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly, and that was a wonderful presentation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Mowbray, and I work for the Maryland Highway Safety Office. We are a department within the Motor Vehicle Administration that is a division of the Maryland Department of Transportation. Today, I will present to you our newest application that is online for public view, the Maryland Fatal Crash Data Dashboard, and walk you through the different components and features of the dashboard. We will not be giving a live demo today. We do not have time for that, but I encourage you after this presentation to explore the application on your own. Before I get started, I wanted to remind us all that the information presented in this application represents people who have lost their lives in preventable crashes. These numbers represent families and communities that are forever changed by traffic violence. There might be a little delay in my slides. Okay, there we go. The Fatal Crash Dashboard was launched in April at our Maryland Highway Safety Summit. The Maryland Highway Safety Office and the Maryland Department of Transportation hold this summit annually and gather partners and agencies around the state of Maryland and in the region and some international partners to talk about ways that we can achieve zero deaths in Maryland. We were able to talk about and launch the new Fatal Crash Dashboard at this summit thanks to the hard work from the Maryland State Police. The Maryland State Police have developed this dashboard using the platform of Tableau, and the data source for the crash data dashboard is the Maryland State Data Warehouse, which is derived from the Automated Crash Reporting System, or ACRS. All law enforcement agencies in Maryland report motor vehicle crash investigations to the ACRS systems, and that is where we've derived the data for the dashboard. It is updated every morning. Once you're logged into once you've accessed the website and you're on the application, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner the date and the timestamp for when the data were most recently updated. Years available, 2016 to as of this morning, and it includes open reports and open investigations, but there is no personally identifiable information. Navigating to the website is easy. You go to our zerodeathsmaryland.gov website, where we have a section called Crash Data Resources. Once you go to that section, you will pull up the website and all the crash data resources will be available to you. Before you get into the data dashboard itself, note that there's additional information, including crash data summaries for overall program areas in Maryland. And we also have summary data for pedestrian crashes and bicycle crashes, as well as information for all of our jurisdictions in Maryland. Please explore these resources before you have a chance to get into the dashboard itself. While you're on the crash data resources page on our Zero Deaths website, there will be a link at the top that says Crash Data Dashboard. When you follow that link, it will bring up another page, the main page for the Crash Data Dashboard. And there's a couple of resources here that you can view before you get into the application itself. I encourage you to explore these areas of the website before you use the application itself, as there's a lot of information that will answer questions you may have as you work through the data. First area of information will be the data definitions. This will explain how we define and how we describe all the information in the data dashboard. We have a list of FAQs that's been compiled based off of requests we've already had over the years and things that have come in since the dashboard has launched. You will probably find an answer to most of your questions there. And I also encourage you to view the demo video before you start using the application itself. It's only a couple minutes long. When you click on the data definitions section, it will bring up a listing of all the different areas that are featured in the data dashboard. Today, we're highlighting pedestrians and bicyclists, our most vulnerable road users, our non-motorists. Here, you will see the exact definition of what we mean by a pedestrian and what we mean by a bicyclist. Again, these data are derived from the automated crash reporting system, or ACRS. On screen, you will see what the officers see when they make a selection for the non-motorist type. For pedestrians, we're talking about pedestrian 01. For bicyclists, 02 and 03, bicyclists and other pedocyclists, which are further described in the data definition section. There are a lot of nuances for how we describe a pedestrian. We derive some of our information from a national manual on crash classifications called ANSI D16, and there is a link in the definitions that will take you to that information and provide some more detail on what we mean by a pedestrian. Once you've entered the dashboard, you will see that there are multiple sub-dashboards and features. Notably, we have areas that are related to our strategic highway safety plan and all the emphasis areas for our 5-year plan to achieve 0 deaths in Maryland. We have sub-dashboards for statewide and jurisdictional fatalities. We have specific interest areas. There's a year-to-date feature. We have a dashboard that just summarized data related to the drivers and the passengers, the occupants of the vehicle. Today, we'll be focusing on non-motorists, but as you can also explore data related to vehicles and roadways. On the fatal crash dashboard, you will see in the upper left-hand corner a feature where you can sort through different visualizations of the data. You can choose multiple years, you can choose 1 year at a time, you can choose all the months, you could choose 1 month or a few months. You can also show the data by the entire state of Maryland, or you can choose a specific jurisdiction based on your needs. I will note that on the main dashboard, you can hover over the sections that are highlighted here for all of our emphasis areas. Once you hover over these areas, a pop-up box will show, and it will actually indicate how many open investigations there are for that current year and how many fatal crash reports this represents. Please note that on the main dashboard, dashboard page, each of these statistics numbers on the main page represent the number of fatalities or persons. When you hover over each section, it will actually tell you the number of incidents where somebody was fatally injured. For example, when you hover over the pedestrian section, you will see here, and this was a screenshot from earlier this year. Unfortunately, this number has risen. We had 58 pedestrian fatalities and 53 incidents. That means that there was more than one pedestrian killed in one or more of these incidents. Similarly, if you hover over bicyclists, you can see that there were 5 bicycle fatal crashes earlier this year. Unfortunately, again, that has risen. In this case, 5 bicyclists were killed in 5 incidents. Note that the dashboard actually has a lot of interactivity. You can spend a lot of time with this, exploring to your needs and looking at your particular jurisdiction or looking at the entire state. Once you work your way through the application, you'll see that there is a map that you can interact with. You can zoom in and out. You can pick specific fatal crashes on the map. On the right, you will see a bar graph. You can choose individual jurisdictions When you make these selections, it will actually change the visualizations at the top and the bottom of the dashboard. As you can see, the summaries will change specific to that jurisdiction once you've made that selection. At the bottom, you can see the time of day, crash hour will change per the selection that you make using the map and the table graph. Another sub-dashboard within the fatal crash dashboard is our emphasis areas. Here we summarize the number of fatalities over the last 5 years. I've highlighted here pedestrians and bicyclists. Each of these emphasis areas is derived from our 5-year strategic highway safety plan. Again, when you go to our zerodeathsmaryland.gov website, I encourage you to explore more than just the crash data page. We have a lot of information about our program areas, how you can get involved, and also the grant programs that we run out of the Highway Safety Office. I will note that in a couple of months, in January, we will open up applications for the federal fiscal year 2025. You'll find a lot of information on the Zero Deaths website, particularly with our strategic highway safety plan initiatives and ways that you can get involved with either our emphasis area teams or other ways that you can help share information with your partners and the public. I mentioned earlier that we have an interest area section of the dashboard. Here we have different fatality categories, different emphasis areas that go beyond our strategic highway safety plan. These categories represent areas where we've had frequent requests over the years. They also represent areas that the Highway Safety Office does focus on our annual plan, including motorcyclists, hit and run crashes, school bus involved, and work zones. For today, I'm highlighting our most vulnerable road users, our pedestrians, and our bicyclists. In that drop-down menu for the interest areas, you can select pedestrians, and you will see a summary of all of the pedestrian fatalities since 2016 if you have all of the years selected in the upper left-hand corner. Again, in that upper left-hand corner, you can change the summary on screen to the year of crash, the month of crash, or the jurisdictions that you're interested in. And you can also see the hours in which pedestrian fatalities have occurred over the years. And here's just a screenshot of our bicyclist fatalities in the same display. Another feature of the dashboard is a year-to-date comparison. This is where we show breakdowns of the number of fatalities by week, by month, and by year, compared to the most recent year, year-to-date. This is where you can see if this year and the previous year are tracking with each other. Are there increases? Are there decreases? You may have seen some recent press releases from the Maryland Department of Transportation and our partners calling attention to the fact that this year our fatalities have shown an alarming increase. It is something that we are all concerned about, and we would encourage everybody out there to pay attention to what's happening with these trends, and also talk to your friends and family about driver behaviors on the road, as these all are leading toward an increase in fatalities this year. In the section for non-motorists, we have additional details about the fatal crashes. These represent information that is provided by law enforcement in their crash investigations through the Acres report. We have several categories that are related to the circumstances of the crash, each summarized here in the display. You can see where the routes that the crashes occurred on. A majority of our pedestrian and non-motorist fatalities do occur on state roads. Not surprising, state roads include highways, arterials where higher speeds are involved. You can see the actions at the time of the crash of the non-motorist, the lighting conditions, the movement of the non-motorist, and the location at the time of the crash where the non-motorist was situated, either on the road, not on the road, and so forth. Just to note again where this information is coming from, it is derived from the Automated Crash Reporting System, or ACRES. On screen, you will see the selections that the officers have of where we're deriving this information. Additionally, in the non-motorist section, we also have further detail about the age and the sex of the non-motorists involved. You will see an age categorization, age groupings. You can actually click on this. Again, the dashboard has a lot of interactivity with it. Once you click on the age groupings, it will show you the individual ages and also break that down by male and female. Please also note that within the categories of the non-motorist circumstances, lighting conditions, for example, the non-motorist movement, there's additional functionality within the dashboard that you will note through a little slide bar that's indicated here with the words top N. This actually represents the number of different attributes in the field that is represented here in the dashboard. So lighting conditions and non-motorist movements are fields in the automated crash reporting system. And then each of those selections is an attribute of that field. By sliding the slider to the right, you can actually increase the number of attributes of the crash that are displayed. Most of the fields in acres have somewhere between 10 and 15 selections. There are a few that have 20 or more selections. If you slide the slider all the way to the last point on the right, that represents the top 15 selections. That really doesn't apply to our non-motorists. We have at least 15 selections here for these particular fields. Again, I'll call your attention to the FAQ section. There's a lot of information here that will answer a lot of the questions that you have about the source of the data, how you can request data, and how do you ask for information specifically about this information. Again, these data are managed and owned by the Maryland State Police. They are going to be your source for the crash data. There is a link to a Tableau data download tool that you can access through the FAQs that will take you directly to a Maryland State Police website where you can download the crash data that you see represented here in the fatal crash dashboard. Note that the crash data download tool does include all crashes that are reported in the acre system, not just fatal crashes. For now, our dashboard is focused only on fatalities. If you're seeking information related to injuries or non-injury crashes, you can obtain that through the Maryland State Police Crash Data Download Tool. This is a screenshot and additional link to that data download tool. Please note that the years available currently are 2018. It is also updated every morning. The difference that is notable between the information here as far as fatal crashes and our data dashboard is that only approved reports are released through the data download tool. So if there is an open investigation and an officer is still working to find out more information about a fatal crash, you will not be able to download that from this data download tool. So you would definitely see a difference in the numbers or the counts of fatalities when you download information from here or when you're trying to compare it to our dashboard. We note that the dashboard itself is the most recent and up-to-date accounting of fatal crashes in Maryland. And again, it does include a summary of investigations that are open, but when you download data from this download tool, it will not include those open reports. One last thing I'd like to cover, because it is a frequent question about some of the emerging trends that we see in Maryland. Reminding you here that this is the current screen the officers have when they're investigating a crash that involves a pedestrian or any non-motorist type. This is the screen that has been used by the ACRE system since 2015. Starting in 2024, the Maryland State Police will launch a new ACRES 2.0 system, and we've expanded the selection for the number of non-motorist types to include scooters, both electric and non-electric, wheelchairs, and we are noting a difference in the cyclist non-motorist type as we are seeing a tremendous number of persons selecting and using electric bicycles out there on our roadways. So in 2024, when this new ACRES 2.0 is launched, we will update the data dashboard to represent any incident that includes these additional non-motorist types. With that, I'll thank you for the opportunity to present today, and I will turn it over to Chester Harvey.
Okay, thank you so much, Molly and Doug. My name is Chester Harvey. I'm the director of the Transportation Policy Research Group at the National Center for Smart Growth, which is housed at the University of Maryland. We are formed under a cooperative agreement with the Maryland Department of Transportation, and so we do a lot of work related to their interests. I'm going to be talking today about some projects that I and my colleagues have been doing. They're probably a bit more conceptual in nature than the plan that Molly shared and the terrific crash dashboard that Doug has been working on. I hope it motivates some interesting conversation about different creative ways that we can plan for pedestrians. As the title connotes here, both within the right-of-way, but also outside the right-of-way. And things that maybe are not normally considered part of the transportation domain. There we go. Okay, so what is the transportation field overlooking in pedestrian planning? Traditionally, as transportation planners, we've focused a lot on things that we most directly control, and that makes a certain amount of sense. The right-of-way is the domain of transportation planning and engineering. And so we have spent a lot of time on things like sidewalks, crosswalks, safety within the right-of-way makes a huge difference. And it makes a huge difference to things like accessibility. Can you physically walk from one place to another? We've also spent a fair amount of time recently thinking about destination accessibility. Essentially, are there places to walk to that are close enough to move around between on foot? However, there are some real limitations, in these structures that are mostly about right-of-way infrastructure and destinations. For example, these two places that are sort of within striking distance of our College Park campus. The top one is considered a walker's paradise. It has lots of destinations, many stores that you could walk to. This is the what used to be the Prince George's Plaza Shopping Center. It even has good sidewalks. It has fairly decent connectivity. There you can see the pedestrian bridge in the distance there. The bottom example, you would probably consider to be a more walkably designed place. It does have those sidewalks. It certainly has destinations, but it has a lot more sort of urban design features that are conducive to pedestrians feeling comfortable in that space. Things that urban designers might call human scale, a sense of enclosure, a degree of transparency with the surrounding land uses so that you as a pedestrian kind of know where you are, can understand where you are, and maybe have something to relate to while you're walking down the street, as opposed to the top example, which is a bit harder on a sort of sensory level to get engrossed with. And yet, by an accessibility metric, this is walk score, the top example is actually more walkable than the bottom example. So these qualities that urban designers espouse, things like enclosure, human scale, complexity, transparency, imageability, they're difficult to measure. And that is a big part of what I, in my research, have been trying to address is, how can we actually get at these qualities in a way that they can be incorporated into transportation planning exercises, into analyses, even perhaps of pedestrian behavioral modeling, so that we're not kind of overlooking them just because they're hard, but rather accounting for them and then thinking about ways that we as transportation planners might actually work with folks in urban design, folks in land use planning to try to increase these qualities as part of our pedestrian planning processes. So some interesting work that I've done previously actually shows that these qualities impact crash severity. Places that are a little bit more like that Prince George's Plaza example, that are, where the buildings are spaced far apart, they're set very far back from the road. tend to be associated with more severe crashes. And this makes a whole lot of sense if you think about, how drivers might drive faster, maybe with a little less caution if you're in a place that feels less constrained. And so these really have very real implications for the behaviors not only of pedestrians, but of other road users that have a huge impact on pedestrians. And we can start measuring some of these qualities using data that are increasingly available to the general public. Things like where buildings are located, so building footprint data. We essentially, have building footprint data now for the entire contiguous US and are able to do this, these sorts of analyses about things like setbacks, the heights of buildings, how far apart they're spaced. Basically, do places feel like the example on the right or the example on the left, and how might that influence the way that pedestrians are behaving and feel in those spaces, as well as other road users. And another really important variable that comes into play around streetscape design is street trees. And increasingly, we also have very good data about this. There's really fantastic street tree data around Baltimore City and County that we've been using that give us a window into places that might feel very sort of conducive to walking just because they have, great tree canopy. Often the lowest hanging fruit way to make a place feel more walkable from a design lens is to add trees, and they contribute to that sense of enclosure, the sense of sort of a complex and investigable place that you can walk around as a pedestrian in. So taking these measurements that we can now do of the sort of design context of streets, we can actually start comparing that to behavioral outcomes. Essentially, do people walk more in places that have some of these design qualities that urban designers are espousing? And indeed they do. This is a study that I did a couple years back in San Francisco, where we found indeed people were more likely to walk in places that, for example, had storefronts along either side of the street, that had trees, that had relatively small setbacks. So, even just bringing the buildings essentially closer to the sidewalk, so there's something to look at and something to interact with as you're walking along the street, as opposed to just a big vast space like in that Prince George's Plaza example. Having somewhat taller buildings, a sense of enclosure can actually help. People are more likely to walk in those places. And then, sorry about that. And then places with no buildings along the side of the street, people were really disinclined to walk in those places. And so I think that helps us think about how land use planning, zoning that might encourage things like large parking lots along the street, or just very large setbacks or gaps between buildings. That's going to make it difficult for people to walk on a sort of distance from a distance lens. It also just might make them not really feel like walking in those places because it's rather uncomfortable. And so another lens that we're taking on this now, and that we're using to bring some of this research to the Maryland context, is asking, who has access to these sorts of places? Are there differences from an equity perspective in who has a human scale streetscape near them, and who might, even if they have destinations that they could walk to, might not really feel appropriate for walking on a more psychological angle. And so one lens that we can look at this through fairly easily is this setback quality. Where are there places where buildings are very far set back from the road, sort of a more suburban context, versus a more traditional neighborhood style of development that might be more conducive. And then look at how this sort of human scale design that's indicated by the setback measure overlaps or not with the more traditional lens on walkability, whether there are destinations that you could walk to. Where do these things align? Where do they not align? And does that give us a sense of where we might need to sort of work on these different qualities of walkability in order to produce places that are walkable across a few different dimensions. So looking at some Maryland area examples, Washington, D.C. On the left, and then Baltimore on the right. These are census block groups where there's both human scale design and there are destinations. So these are places that by both of those measures, you would say are fairly walkable places. And what we've done here is mapped those with respect to the most advantaged block groups. So these are places that are relatively high income, high education, and least advantaged block groups, places that are relatively, lower income and lower education. Most advantaged is higher income. And one of the things that's really striking is that in a place like Washington, D.C., there is a lot of overlap between the more advantaged neighborhoods and the places that are more walkable along both of these metrics. So places like Northwest D.C. are conducive to walking in both of these ways, fairly wealthy. In Baltimore, we actually see that these different lenses on walkability, both human scale and destination accessibility, are fairly diversely spread across the city in terms of the social advantage. So West Baltimore, for example, has a lot of really walkable qualities that are also correlated with lower socioeconomic advantage. Of course, places like Fells Point and East Baltimore also have some of those walkable qualities, but there's more variability across the city in who has access to walkable design and to walkable destinations. Now, of course, there are also mismatches. So these block groups that are lit up on the maps now show places that have destinations, so places that you could walk to that are close enough to walk to, but perhaps lack that human scale dimension that might make you actually want to walk there. And you can see now that several neighborhoods on the eastern side of Washington, D.C. are really lighting up. If we were to just look at walkability through the lens of destination accessibility, we might kind of assume that these places are great for walking. And indeed, they might actually be quite problematic because they don't have that design dimension that makes people actually want to walk there. And likewise in Baltimore, there are a number of more outlying places across the socioeconomic disadvantage spectrum that have this mismatch, where again we might assume that they're fairly walkable, but there's some real problems from a design perspective in terms of whether people might want to be walking. So here's an example of one of those mismatches. This is the example that I showed at the very beginning. So the mall, it's now called the Mall of Prince George's. I still call it Prince George's Plaza. But this is a place that has destinations and is really lacking human scale. It lights up on this map. And it's also a relatively disadvantaged part of Prince George's County. And so, this is the sort of place that we could be emphasizing developing more walkable design qualities in our land use planning and our design planning in order to essentially match the high degree of destination accessibility that exists in this place. And also, decent infrastructure within the right-of-way. As I said, there are good sidewalks. There are decent opportunities to cross, although the roads are quite large, and that is a big obstacle in a place like this. But there is this potential to really increase walkability through those things that are somewhat more outside the conventional transportation lens. Things like urban design and land use. And conversely, places like West Baltimore, as I mentioned, really light up as places that have actually great sort of design qualities and might be lacking destinations. So, this example of Prospect Street in West Baltimore I mean, really terrific in terms of, human scale architectural bones. It's a very, walkable feeling street. Could use a little investment, could use some neighborhood input. This is also a place that we might target, or we might identify as being at risk for gentrification, because it has all of these great design qualities built into it, has been disinvested in, and so one of the things that we think about a whole lot at our center is how to identify these places that have really promising qualities, could use some investment, and how to address those issues in ways that really help the people who already live there use this as a very walkable place without necessarily just like leapfrogging into newcomers that might see opportunity in a place like this. Okay, so now I want to turn to a different project where we're thinking about a number of these same things. This is a project we've been doing with WMATA within the Washington, D.C. context and stretching out into Maryland along several of those metro lines. The question that WMATA has posed to us is how changes in land use, especially around things like transit-oriented development, could affect ridership. And so we've gotten into these questions of, well, what does transit-oriented development mean in terms of the walkability of the neighborhoods around these transit stations? And using some innovative data sources that I'll show you in a moment, we've been able to get into some of these same, we've been able to measure some of these same qualities around walkable streetscapes and design that we think really impact whether people want to access metro stations, to walk to them versus perhaps drive to them. So transit-oriented development, it's very easy to see how they might mean an increase in housing and jobs. These are the sorts of origins and destinations that we put into an accessibility model conventionally. TOD also typically has some sort of design component to it. It often, it involves a sort of, higher density, slightly more urban design type, basically producing this human scale walking environment that we've just been talking about. And so we've been working with a partner called State of Place, which has developed techniques for measuring lots and lots of design qualities from street level. So they advertise here that they're using about 150 different data points to produce an index of essentially walkability, or some of the different components that might go into walkability from a design perspective. Recently, so they began by doing a lot of this inventorying by hand, and have now figured out how to use imagery from Street View to, in an automated way, detect different features within streetscapes, and then measure those continuously along blocks and throughout entire districts. And they're using those to produce all of these different sort of indices of design qualities. So things like density, proximity, availability of public spaces, different amenities for bicyclists and pedestrians, aesthetics, personal safety, and then they can collapse those further into a sort of cohesive single index, or we can use them separately. We're actually experimenting with using both of those. Here is their single, the sort of master index of all of those qualities for the walk sheds around every station in the WMATA system. And so so we're using this data in a current project. We actually just got started with this about 2 months ago, and we don't have final results for that yet. So I'm not going to go in that direction. But what I do want to point out is that this really offers us the opportunity to think about current conditions around WMATA stations and the potential to develop those environments in a way that is more walkable and might be picked up by an index like the State of Place measures as an indicator of a more walkable type place. So this is an example from right outside the West Hyattsville Metro Station. It's within this transit-oriented development zone that was developed in 2006. And you can see this road has a number of features that we would consider to be highly walkable. It has great sidewalk infrastructure, great crossing infrastructure. It even has some good bike infrastructure that's a recent development. It's obviously quite close to the metro station. It's quite close to a number of residential areas. That said, its current design conditions, which would be reflected in those state of place metrics, make it maybe not the most comfortable place in the world to walk as a pedestrian. The buildings are very set back from the road. There's lots of sort of vast spaces that are difficult to relate to as a pedestrian. And so, walking from a residential area in Hyattsville to this station, it is really not the most comfortable experience. And indeed, most people drive to this station. There's a huge parking lot there. There's a big kiss and ride area. And so you can imagine how implementing something like the transit-oriented development plan, which has been put in place for that area that's shown on the right, the little red V on that map shows approximately the perspective that we're looking at on the left, would really change how people might view that area as being walkable from a street level. If you had buildings that are basically right along the sidewalk, interesting things to look at, a more human scale environment to walk through, you might be a lot more interested in walking to that metro station, which is sort of snugged within that built context on the right, as opposed to being in a pretty sort of vast, open, fairly auto-centric space on the left. So I'm going to leave it with that. I hope that provides some interesting food for thought about innovative ways that we could improve walkability, looking both at the right-of-way and also beyond the right-of-way, and working with our land use and urban design partners to improve walkability. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chester, and thank you to the great panel of speakers. Throughout the webinar, I've been assembling questions from the audience. You can continue to submit questions throughout the discussion using the chat function on the right side of your screen. We will get to as many questions as we can until noon Eastern time. For the Q&A portions, I'm going to ask the speakers to turn on their cameras, and I'm going to dive right into some of the questions. I'm going to start with one that is sort of geared towards everyone, if you have something to contribute. How can we measure the degree of collaboration between drivers and pedestrians or cyclists from the design of the built environment? You mentioned behavior as an independent action versus a degree of connection, which I think is an interesting way of looking at things. It sort of puts things in a triangle where behavior of pedestrians, behavior of drivers, and the design of the built environment all come together to influence safety. How can we influence that better, and how can that interplay be measured?
I guess I can start. I can start us off there. There's a lot going on with that question, but it's a terrific one. Something that I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about in some prior research is how we conceptualize building for safety. So this is one lens that we can think about this through. The traditional traffic engineering approach to designing for safety is to essentially accommodate poor decision making. So, if someone drives fast and they lose control of their vehicle, making something called a clear zone, for example, that they can drive off the road into without hitting somebody or something. And this makes a whole lot of sense in certain contexts. So this gets us back to what Molly was presenting on, and different designs for different contexts. The problem is that when we introduce that into more urban context, so traditionally that's applied in more rural and suburban places, it means really removing things from the road. You end up with, large setbacks, no street trees, places that are very autocentric feeling. An alternative approach is to design in ways that change, basically, that make drivers, feel like they're in a constrained space and potentially slow down and drive more cautiously. And so that's sort of flipping the paradigm, where we're not designing to accommodate drivers, we're designing to influence drivers. And I think that has a lot of potential to be a useful paradigm as we think about pedestrian design, because it leaves more space to, insert pedestrians into the road instead of removing them from it.
I can add some thoughts here, specifically since the person who asked the question kind of focused on behavior. You'll note that in the fatal crash dashboard, we do not include every aspect of the crash. Notably, some of the driver behaviors that might be involved, or the pedestrian behaviors around impairments, other types of distractions. I know that, in crash investigations, obtaining this information, officers obtaining that can be very difficult, particularly getting toxicology results. They could be delayed. Some information that's collected in the crash report can be subjective. Maybe there are no witnesses to the crash. So was the driver speeding? Was the driver distracted by their phone? Was the pedestrian distracted? So there's a lot of sort of, incomplete and missing information in crash investigations, particularly the Akers report that was represented in the dashboard, and that you'll find if you download the data itself. So I always say, take that information with a bit of a grain of salt and some caveats that, officers are trying to do the best they can. Their first job is to make sure everybody on the scene is secure and safe, and get the roads clear. And then afterwards, they're filling out that report. So it can be difficult to come across that information. So the crash report is not the entire story. And we know that in the Highway Safety Office, because we worked a couple of years ago with some researchers to do what we call a deep dive into fatal crash incidents involving pedestrians and bicyclists. We looked at an entire year, 2016, and we worked directly with the investigators of those crashes. We got access to autopsy reports, medical examiner data, videos of crashes. There were some crashes where there was actually businesses who had a camera trained on the road where the crash happened. So we had a whole lot more information that is available in that sort of initial Akers report. And when you look at the more comprehensive investigation of a pedestrian crash or non-motorist crash, there's a lot more that comes out of that. And, again, like I said earlier, these aren't just numbers, these are people. And sort of a more holistic story comes when you're actually looking at the full investigation. I think it was the first webinar, Walkinar, earlier this month with Strong Towns, and they kind of do something similar. So we did that a couple of years ago, and we discovered just a lot more nuance in some of these incidents. So when it comes to behaviors, it's not always straightforward. Even if the officer does or doesn't, select the field for at fault, that is not, 100%, this person was at fault, this person was at fault. There's a lot of circumstances that go into the crash. So really understanding behavior, I think, you really need to understand the context of the road, the context of the incident, and kind of look beyond sort of the aggregate data and really understand what's happening sort of in these individual locations and some of these incidents to really see what's going on as far as behavior between the non-motorists and the drivers.
Great. Doug, I have two questions that are kind of related to what you just said, and I think they're a little bit follow-up questions. Do officers receive training on the importance of the data that they collect for Akers? And someone else has asked, does training include instructions for the public on how to walk or bicycle on a road without sidewalks? So I guess for everyone, do you know of training efforts that are working towards getting better results, whether in the data or the actual decrease in crashes in general?
Yeah, I mean, I could take the question to start with about training for officers. So yes, officers are trained for crash investigations when they go through the academy. To be honest, it is not a very long training. They will get most of their training for crash investigations when they actually enter the force. They are trained, in the field by seasoned veterans. Most of the larger police departments actually have a training division. And they will periodically conduct training that is required for certification for certain, aspects of their job. Over the years, my office, the Highway Safety Office, we've worked with law enforcement to conduct annual, conferences in person. We do something in Ocean City every year with law enforcement supervisors, and we always incorporate a data aspect in those trainings and talk about how the data are used and talk about data quality. We invite trainers from the Maryland State Police and other academies to come and talk about, data quality. I know when I started this job 15 years ago, a lot of the officers that I spoke with kind of assumed that the reports were just used by insurance companies. So their job was, clear the road, fill out the report as minimal as possible, submit the report by the end of the shift and go about their day. But as we work directly with law enforcement more and more in highway safety, and especially our traffic enforcement officers and those who work with our office, and we're able to get the word out, they understand more and more that this information is critical for not just insurance companies, but engineers, education specialists, public health officials. So we're able, through a lot of channels with the Highway Safety Office and the Department of Transportation, to get the word out that this data is critical for decision making, both at the state level, the local level, and even our policymakers. And that's one of the benefits of now having a public tool to access this information. We hear from advocates, we hear from policymakers that being able to see this information online helps them, understand, the trends, some of the concerns, some of the issues that are rising. And out of this, there's kind of a feedback loop as we look at the data that's presented online. It's being used more often in a public setting. I'm able to go back to law enforcement and say, hey, here's some improvements we can make. I'm actually working with an officer right now, trooper, actually, sergeant, with Maryland State Police, to look specifically at the seatbelt use field on the crash report. There's a lot of unknowns collected sometimes for some reasonable reasons. When an officer arrives on scene, sometimes the people who are involved in the crash have already been transported by ambulance and EMS. So that officer needs to look at the car for evidence of seatbelt use. So I'm working with this sergeant to develop some materials to talk about how to improve collection. So we are trying to look at the data and see trends, but also look at if there's incomplete data or inaccurate data, and then work back with our law enforcement partners to try and improve the data. That is absolutely happening.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in there? Nope. Okay. I guess this question is for Molly. How will transit and transit users be accommodating in the PSAP program? And the user is, or the questioner is particularly interested in how it addresses those with mobility challenges.
Sure. So thank you for the question. First, you'll have noticed that rail transit walk sheds were a part of the prioritization scoring. So absolutely understanding that these safety improvements need to increase accessibility to transit and for all forms. And also when we talk about pedestrian, this absolutely includes individuals who have mobility challenges. Some things that can help with that, giving more time for crosswalks, so leading pedestrian intervals, and other countermeasures like that. So ensuring that everyone who's using the transportation network system, there are countermeasures put in place to ensure that these are safe facilities to be using. So these things are absolutely considered, and working with our transit partners when designing projects and things like that will help to ensure that accessibility to these facilities will be enhanced or maintained throughout these projects.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Molly and Doug. The PSAP mapping of needs is valuable, but what about rural or less dense areas like La Plata, Maryland, that has accidents and deaths, but not enough to rise to the priority status? How do these communities compete for funding to address known issues on their roadways?
So I think I can go ahead and take the first pass at this question. So absolutely, I think it's important to note that while with the PSAP there's a little heightened attention to these specific corridors, there are several other existing funding sources for pedestrian improvements that are not going away and are still being used in areas that are not necessarily identified as high priority by the PSAP. We certainly understand that need exists outside of the areas identified by the PSAP. So would encourage you to feel free to reach out to me with specific locations, and we can look at those areas and work with our district partners to see what can be done. But yes, other funding programs that have been used previously are still in existence outside of the PSAP specific projects.
Sure, and I'll add to, from a data analyst point of view, when you run statistics on the number of crashes in Maryland, if you're just doing a count of total crashes by location, you're going to see hotspots. You're going to see a greater number of crashes where the population centers are, where the greater population is. So that's always kind of like your first cut of an analysis. The greater the number of people, the greater number of incidents. Right. But what we do in the Highway Safety Office, usually, we work with specific partners, especially if they have a project with us, or if we're working with law enforcement on a high visibility enforcement campaign. We will look at individual jurisdictions in and of themselves and include some additional information that will provide some context. So unfortunately for pedestrians and bicyclists, we don't have a great exposure measure, at least not statewide, at least not consistent, like we do with vehicle miles traveled. So sometimes we'll use, vehicle miles traveled as an indicator of exposure for all road users, or we'll use population as an exposure measure. And when you do that and you run rates of crashes, the problem and the overrepresentation tends to shift away from those higher centers and more toward your rural or Eastern Shore, when you actually take into consideration the population there. I know that when we do analysis on the Eastern Shore, particularly, for Ocean City and Worcester County, their population throughout the year is one of the lowest in the entire state of Maryland, except when you consider the population that travels there during the summer or the warmer months for vacation, for events and things like that. So it all kind of depends on how you're looking at the data. But if you're looking for overrepresentation, if you're looking for areas where that are underserved, we definitely, as Chester brought up and Molly have discussed too, we are now incorporating equity into all of our analyses. And when we do that, we are now focusing more on areas that have historically been overlooked, neglected, by just running simple numbers, simple aggregate, counts. So by incorporating additional information about the environment, about the populations, whether that's using census data, whether that's using historical information about Baltimore redlining and some of the effects for that, as we incorporate more factors into the crash data analysis, it does tend to then now highlight the less populous areas and sort of the more at-risk areas.
Interesting, thank you. You mentioned equity, so this brings up a question I think that is geared towards everyone. Does crash data include demographic data to determine whether particular groups are being impacted at higher levels, given the state's focus on equity? Are any of the studies or have any of the studies that you've all done indicated that particular groups are more impacted regardless of the context, whether it's urban or rural?
Yeah, I can start with that, and hopefully my colleagues can add to this. Very specifically on the crash report, there is limited demographic information that's derived from usually the license or other information the officer gathers in the investigation. Right now, there is not a field for race or ethnicity. So if you just go and download the crash data from the online tool, you're not going to know the race or ethnicity of anybody who was in the crash. You'll get age, you'll get sex. We've done some zip code analysis, which we can tie to census information, but directly on the crash report, there's some limited demographic information. However, we have worked with researchers at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, the National Study Center, to link the crash data to driver records, to hospital records, and perhaps even to medical examiner records, so we can actually look at crash outcomes by these additional categories, by race and ethnicity specifically. So I know that if you look at national data, the FARS system, the Fatality Analysis Reporting System that NHTSA manages, they do include information about race and ethnicity. And over the past couple of years, they have released reports that have indicated that those people of color, those persons, African American, Black, Asian, especially American Indian and Alaskan, they do have higher rates of fatalities. They are more vulnerable in some of these crashes. So yes, it's possible through analysis to identify additional demographic information. And when we do that, yes, it does indicate that there are populations that are more vulnerable than others.
This isn't about crash data specifically. I think Doug is certainly the expert on that in this room. But our work does suggest that that by and large, disadvantaged communities in Maryland have less access to what we would call walkable design. So with the exceptions of some of the examples I pointed out in West Baltimore, which are real exceptions, honestly, on a national scale. That is a huge difficulty that lower income and communities of color do tend to be in more auto-centric landscapes, and there's a division just in terms of which places have received attention in terms of walkable design in neighborhoods.
Right. Great, thank you. We just got a great question. Have any of you come up with a way to identify problem locations where the number or severity of accidents are higher than other locations and compared them for similarities with other high crash areas? So are there design features that are common amongst the different hotspot areas across the state? Or has that been looked at?
I guess I could jump in here. I don't know how helpful I'm going to be on this one, because in my experience over the years, I've seen articles in the media about this is the most dangerous road in America, things like that, and sort of the how you measure that's difficult. Some days there's roads that are wide open and cars are going really fast and it's a 6-lane highway and everybody's sort of at risk, and that same road for a couple months could be down to a couple of lanes through construction. So we hear in data comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, comparing any road to another, whether it's in Maryland or in a jurisdiction or across the country is very difficult, and I would say would probably create more questions than it would answers. There's ways to, kind of normalize the data. As I said, we know, how many cars are on particular roads, so we can sort of compare roads with similar number of, cars traveling on a day-to-day basis. Like I said, we have limited information on pedestrian and bicycle exposure. I think one of the biggest limitations we have, and this is in this country and around the world, is the data that we don't know. And some recent innovations in big data have started to kind of add to the discussion. But what about near misses? What about locations where people are avoiding crossing And you know, so we don't even know who wants to cross there and just avoiding it altogether. So you know, there's a lot of missing information we have, I think, to even compare any one road or one intersection or section of road to another. So the more that we kind of look beyond just the crash data, I think we'll have better insight into the context for, you know, the real lived experiences of people who are using these roads. You know, so the more technology we have, I've seen, you know, cameras that can be affixed to intersections that can actually count the number of people who cross. So as we bring more and more of that information in, I think we can start to have better comparisons of, you know, roads that need more attention, that aren't getting that attention now. Because again, the crash data is what we're looking at after the bad thing already happened, right? So it's not predictive. It's looking backwards. It's already a failure. It's a measure of the failure. So if we can actually look more forward and actually look at locations that need improvement, that people want to use more safely, I think that's where we can actually start to make some improvements.
Molly, do you want to take a?
Sure. So I absolutely agree with everything Doug was saying about, you know, comparing different roadways to each other. And I think it does require more of a shift to a proactive approach. And I think that's one of the things that we are trying to do with the context-driven toolkit, to understand that where these countermeasures are being installed, what kind of impact that they're having. And if there is a similar area or a similar corridor that has been experiencing the same problems, we can kind of look back and say, okay, well, this worked here. No guarantees, but we have sort of an idea that it will work in this area. But I appreciate your question, and I think it really does require kind of a more proactive switch to improvements.
Great.
So I want to caveat this by saying it's not Maryland specific, but speed is the worst enemy of a pedestrian or a bicyclist. And so, you know, countermeasures that are probably most effective are those that make roadways where you're interacting heavily with pedestrians and bicyclists less conducive to speed. You know, signal to drivers, slow down, and that, you know, related to that, like large arterial roadways that are speed oriented going through, you know, heavily traffic, you know, places that are heavily trafficked by pedestrians and cyclists are very problematic and very difficult from an engineering perspective to figure out how to negotiate those competing interests. Where there are alternatives to route pedestrians and bicyclists away from those spaces and maybe on parallel roads, those are terrific. They're very difficult often within a suburban or rural context where you don't have parallel roads. So anything that can slow people down.
Yes. We are getting towards the end of our hour and a half. Are you all willing to stay for one more question and then final comment?
Sure.
All right. This question has to do with land uses. So in areas where land uses and designs are perhaps grandfathered from the 50s and 60s, like strip plazas with parking in the front, are there any strategies for communities to change the existing community scape, whether it's redevelopment or adding pedestrian infrastructure that makes these environments more conducive to safety and walking?
I guess I'll start just because I think I'm the one that instigated that. Trees are your best friend because they are relatively quick to implement. I mean, they might still take decades to grow, but it doesn't require completely redeveloping the built environment. They provide a sense of enclosure. They provide a sense of scale. They actually have terrific sort of additional effects in terms of water treatment and air treatment and shade, which is a huge issue, you know, around things like the heat effect. So I highly recommend urban forestry as a solution. Sort of related to that, separating, if you can put a row of trees between traffic and pedestrians, that can have an enormous effect of providing shelter for those pedestrians. And then finally, as there are opportunities to develop, to redevelop a property that may have, that huge parking lot with the strip mall, just working hard to make sure that incrementally places are developed in a more pedestrian friendly way. But that certainly will take decades, and that's very difficult.
Yes. Anyone else? All right, this was a really great conversation. I want to give each of you an opportunity to sort of give some last remarks, things that you might have wanted to say, but weren't able to get in your presentation or that came to mind during the question and answer period. And we'll start with Molly.
Okay, I guess I'll just keep it brief. I just want to say thank you, and especially thank you to Chester and Doug for your great presentations and for the great questions and conversation. SHA looks forward to communicating more about the PSAP as we move forward. So, stay tuned and excited to share more in the future. Thanks so much.
Okay, Doug?
Yeah, I also want to express my appreciation for my co-presenters and everybody who helped administer this. It's a great opportunity to get the word out about all the initiatives that are happening here in Maryland and the Maryland Department of Transportation. We do want to be more transparent with information that we have access to. So I'm an open data proponent. Maryland is an open data state. It takes some time to get through some of the policies and the agreements with that. So I know it's slow. But trust me that I do work with colleagues, and my leadership does believe in getting more and more information out there to the public so that you all have information to help make decisions. I'm actually legally, limited to be able to kind of go before, the Maryland General Assembly myself unless asked. But many of you on this call are advocates, are members of the public. If you have information, that helps you actually go and inform, our policy makers. So I would just encourage, use the information online, get out there and talk to the people who are writing the laws, who are making the policies, use this information to help persuade them, to make the changes that are needed. And then we'll get out there and we'll do the work. So thank you.
Thank you. Chester?
Likewise, we'd like to thank Molly and Doug for some really thought-provoking presentations. And I was very happy that I think there was some real convergence around the themes of context and safety and how those can influence behavior across all three of our presentations. And so I, just encourage folks to go forward and think about how you can work on affecting context to make your community safer and make those incremental changes that will take some time, but are definitely in the, we're working in the right direction, and we'll certainly make those improvements.
Great. Well, thank you all. This has been a really great conversation, and I appreciate your time. This concludes the formal portion of our third 2023 Walkinar. And I encourage you, the audience, to remain involved by reviewing and sharing your thoughts on the Maryland Statewide Bicycle Pedestrian Master Plan. Comments will be accepted through November 20th. These comments will be incorporated into a final plan that is set to be adopted in January of 2024. Review the plan and submit feedback at 2050marylandppmp.com. Now I would like to offer my gratitude to Molly, Doug, and Chester for their presentations and for such an engaging discussion. Thank you to everyone who attended today and to John Coleman, who helped make this event run smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online soon, and when you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a survey. Please take a few moments to provide your feedback so we can improve the webinar experience. All attendees will also receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation that can be used to claim other continuing education credits. Keep an eye on your email box for details on future webinars, including our final 2023 Walkinar on equity next Thursday, October 26th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, with speakers Mike Rodriguez, Matt Johnson, and Charles Marone, who will share their unique experiences. We hope you can join us next week. Have a great day. Thank you.